Asymmetrical Haircuts, Justice Update with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
And hi, Molly. Tell us, why do we have the pleasure of your company today?
That's a great question. I don't know why you guys keep having me back on this podcast.
Get your own podcast, Molly.
I know, I really should. I had a podcast and I quit, and they keep having me back on too. I don't understand why. Why am I here? Earlier this year, I did a reporting trip to Ukraine to write about international justice issues. And I think very often on this podcast and me and my own writing, we focus a lot on the legal aspects of the conflict, right? What is a war crime? How do you prove a political leader is responsible for crimes happening on a battlefield? But of course, what underpins all of these cases is evidence.
Oh, yeah, that tricky stuff, evidence. Comes in lots of different shapes and sizes, and it keeps on changing and morphing over the years now, particularly that we've got mobile phones and that lots of people upload stuff to platforms. We've done some pods around this. Maybe the one that comes to mind to start with is how judges look at evidence. We can do a link to that one in the show notes. That involved a mock hearing organised out of Swansea, at which the Bellingcat guys, who I know are going to reappear in the podcast again, were presenting some video footage evidence off the internet to a judge. And she was a real ICC judge, Joanna Corner. This was a mock case. And the guy challenging this evidence was the person now in charge of the Palestine investigation at the ICC, Andrew Cayley. And he was saying, no, you can't use this evidence. So it was very surreal, but really important. But I'll have a look through our archive and see all the different stuff that we've done that sort of relates exactly to evidence gathering.
So for me, the war in Ukraine was the first time I had been personally confronted with how evidence collection works. Trials that I had covered prior to the Ukraine conflict, of course, I had kind of covered after the fact, right? I mean, we all know that the wheels of justice turn slowly. And what I got to see a lot on the ground there is sort of how and the various ways that people are collecting evidence, from the ICC conducting investigations on the ground to a city archivist who we'll hear from later who's collecting CCTV footage. There's just kind of a lot of ways to do this. And it kind of, I don't know, it surprised me. I found it interesting. And I have a big personality, so I made you guys let me do a podcast on it.
To have an idea of the background and what we're talking about, as of recording, the Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General has identified more than 130,000 potential incidents of war crimes. They have issued more than 250 notices of suspicion, which is a kind of precursor to an arrest warrant. And Ukrainian courts have so far convicted more than 100 people for violating the laws of war, and most of those were in absentia.
Yeah, I mean, on the pod, we keep on doing stuff about these trials and these processes in Ukraine, exactly how they're being done and what the challenges are. We did one with judges, for example, talking about the practical difficulties of physically sitting in a courtroom and judging a case in the middle of a war.
Yeah, and for all of these cases, right, for all of this to work, you have to have evidence, right? You need photos, you need videos, you need testimony, you need documents, you need linkage evidence.
And when you have all that, the question is, where are you going to go to submit it? There's lots of places. The Ukrainian government has a website. The ICC has a portal. Lots of NGOs encourage people to turn information over or collect information and then hand it over to the court or the prosecutors.
So what's that portal called again, Steph?
OTP Link, indeed, is what it's called.
Billion-dollar institution, and that's the best name they could come up with.
And have you ever tried to use it? Or do you know anyone who has?
In the sense that I looked how it would work and what kind of stuff you had to fill in, but haven't actually uploaded anything because, not a lot of war crimes being committed around my house in Leiden, apparently. But I think a lot of people are doing it that we talk to, and it's very straightforward. It's kind of like filling in a form and attaching some documents. If you've ever applied for a job in the last 5 years, it's probably very much like that.
At a conference just recently here in Vilnius, I was hearing just a little bit about how AI is being used already at the stage of, as stuff is being submitted, to already identify people's faces and already start to sift the evidence as it goes through whatever the channel is, channel tunnel towards different bits of the OTP. So I think it's something we should take a look at some point.
I had a chat with the guy who does the kind of AI applications for the OTP, and he said indeed facial recognition, geolocation of places, and sometimes picking out keywords in some of the evidence or key places is something that they let the algorithm do for them, or that they're planning to have the algorithm do for them. But of course also assured me that it was always being reviewed by humans.
So if you have like a law and order understanding of how justice works, like this seems all insane to me, right? Because like you have police and the police go out and they investigate the evidence and they turn it over to the prosecutor, right? That's like how investigations work. But of course, like that's not the world that we live in anymore. And now you have all of this kind of creative, I guess, evidence collection, right? That this stuff kind of didn't exist in the same ways. I mean, you always had journalists sort of looking into things, but like I think a lot of this stuff was quite new, that you have all of these NGOs and this open source stuff and Bellingcat. And from the first place that I kind of encountered this, you have to go all the way back into time until March 2020, which, does anybody remember what we were doing in March 2020?
Well, I think I actually remember 1983 and maybe 1998 a bit more clearly than I do 2020. Wasn't that kind of my COVID fug?
Yeah, well, I remember where you and I were, Molly, because there was lots of hand sanitizer and elbow bumping at the opening of the MH17 trial, where the Netherlands tried 4 men, 3 Russians and a Ukrainian, eventually convicted 3 in absentia for supplying the Buk missile system used to shot down flight MH17, a passenger airliner which took off from Amsterdam in July 2014 and was shot down over eastern Ukraine by Russian-backed forces.
Yeah, and the Netherlands took the lead in that kind of prosecution because most of the passengers on board that plane were Dutch. A joint investigative team, or JIT, was formed with Australia, Malaysia, Belgium, and Ukraine. They had the most number of citizens, and of course, Ukraine being the physical location of where the tragedy occurred. And on the basis of their investigation, the Dutch authorities announced in 2019 that they would prosecute these 4 suspects, which this trial was huge, I think, especially considering it was essentially a Dutch criminal trial that just got inundated with media attention.
Absolutely. There was so much attention for whatever the Dutch thought of. And then we had this kind of weird 1-2 where Bellingcat was also very closely investigating what was happening with MH17 and kind of where the missiles came through and the transport. And what would happen is Bellingcat would kind of publicize these investigations, and we paid attention to it. But then the Dutch prosecutorial team would take the Bellingcat evidence and would have to assess it on its own again. So you would basically sit through a Bellingcat presentation of what they had found, and then the people in the JIT would never really say anything about this investigation, and then they would take a couple of months to kind of go through, check the work of Bellingcat, and then in 3 or 4 months they would have their own presentation, basically with the same material, confirming what we had already reported from Bellingcat, but then giving it the kind of official prosecutorial stamp.
Yeah, I think at some point I made a joke about the JIT investigation just basically being like a copy-paste or a fact-check of Bellingcat, essentially. Yeah, and I was fairly surprised, I think, at this. I don't think I was the only one. The first time I'd ever seen anything like this, where you had this sort of independent, like, outside media organization kind of playing such a fundamental role. We're going to listen to a clip now from the trial, which was via the translator. So the original obviously is in Dutch, but there was a translation into English, and you can hear where the prosecution is explaining where their evidence came from.
The scene of the white smoke trail on one of the 2 photographs, because the trail is clearly vertical and is most pronounced at the horizon. The KNMI concludes that the trail could come from an aircraft at a high altitude. The KNMI has also concluded that the cloud seen on the photo matches the cloud pattern visible on satellite images in the afternoon of 17 July 2014. The KNMI has also investigated the direction of the smoke trail based on features in the surroundings on the photographs and the coordinates, the location of the photographer. The KNMI has determined the direction of these photographs. The same investigation was conducted by a private blogger, Bellingcat, and the investigation team. All this investigation indicates that the photographs of the smoke trail were taken in southeastern direction from a flat north of Torres, and that the path of the smoke trail matches a launch from the Performaisky farm field.
So, I mean, Steph and Janet, you guys have been at this longer than I have. Did you guys see stuff like this before? Did I just kind of come to this too late?
It's definitely more and more part of this world, as you've already said, Molly. What I was thinking about was how there are kind of different kinds of bodies that have been set up to do investigations. And in one example would be CIJA, who've got all this documentation about the Syrian command structure, and they've analysed it and reorganised it. And that's been used in many European trials, universal jurisdiction trials. While I'm here in Vilnius, I've been looking at how civil society is collecting evidence for potential Belarus trials. And just to give a small shout out, there's a new publication from the Journal of International Criminal Justice, which we'll put a link up to in the show notes. And they're looking specifically at how a whole range of civil society is investigating, producing, analysing evidence. And that's been put together, I think, partly by Danya Chekel and Priya Pillai, who are both friends of the pod. What about you, Steph?
Well, I'm trying to think of, I know in the last years, this whole idea of civil society doing their own evidence collection has become more and more prominent. And you see that that is what people want to do, but there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding about what evidence courts need. And so there's a lot of guidelines. I think there's now even a guideline from the ICC on how you work together with civil society organizations that collect these evidences.
It's really minimalist, the ICC guidelines.
Yeah, but the guideline seems to be, please don't, wait for us. And I have to say that I haven't seen it so much used in trials, mostly in kind of background. There were some Dutch war crimes trials dealing with the Afghan military information or military intelligence, I want to say, and people running prisons, and they use some of the kind of NGO collected evidence or background, but they use it mostly for background. I find that in the trials that I follow, judges have always been kind of reluctant to really embrace NGO information, and this MH17 trial with Bellingcat was also the first time that I saw it so clearly embraced. And that was also something that the defense kind of jumped on, that the prosecutors were kind of slavishly following Bellingcat and didn't do their own investigation, kind of, quote unquote. So it really is something that is on the rise, and I think we'll see more of it. But I think in terms of how much civil society thinks it can really collect as evidence and how much is actually used in trials is probably very limited. But it is used very much in media reporting. And as a journalist, I'm very grateful for all that evidence gathering. But you kind of hit the same issue, that if you gather all this different evidence and you talk to a lot of investigators, that makes it more problematic for people prosecuting.
I spoke to, while I was in Ukraine and in the lead up to Caroline Edgerton, and I asked her, who is a former ICTY prosecutor. And one of the things I was kind of interested in is like how different Ukraine was from the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And, you know, she told me that like this just didn't exist basically at the time in the same way, that these organizations did not really exist on the same scale. And also, of course, that like the access to this evidence was quite different. She, you know, one of the things that she said is that they relied a lot on journalists who were there, but that means you have to be on the ground, right? Because this is pre the internet. So Bellingcat doesn't work without the internet, right? I mean, this open source kind of material, but it also doesn't work without things like smartphones. And so it's just, you know, I think we talk about how technology has changed things, but I don't think I had really thought about it so much until I was kind of confronted with just how different prosecuting this conflict is going to be versus, I think, the things that we have seen prosecuted like most recently. And another thing that is like kind of different from previous conflicts is like the number of Ukrainian NGOs which were involved in this. So I interviewed, not on tape, unfortunately, Dmytro Koval, who's the legal director of Truth Hounds, during my Ukraine reporting. That was founded in 2014, and it documents and investigates war crimes in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And Koval told me that like his group manages like these two complex databases of evidence, including like a case management tool, which, I mean, you just couldn't envision something like this existing, right? Like prior to this conflict, both for like logistical reasons and also for like technological reasons. And this group is, one of the groups that's partially behind the universal jurisdiction complaint filed with the German prosecutors, which for a story I did about universal jurisdiction complaint, I interviewed Anya Neistat, who I think has also been on the podcast before.
One of the things that we were looking at with Anya, together with Eva Buso, was some of the good and the bad practices that you can have around documentation, and particularly kind of multiple interviews of the same people. So this whole area is really challenging. But yeah, I'll put a link in for that as well so people can listen back. So yeah, it's a wide, there are so many aspects of what you're talking about, Molly. There's so many directions you can go. Well, where are you going to take us next?
I mean, we could do 10 podcasts on this subject, I feel, but Janet is a nightmare and will not let me do that, which is probably for the best. So Steph once made this remark, I don't know if it was to me or just during an interview or something, about how much international justice has changed, that it used to be a question of should the ICC exist at all. And now the question is that like it's a given that it will be there. So what does international justice mean, kind of coming from that standpoint? And I interviewed a bunch of people who lived under Russian occupation or returned to areas that had been occupied, who kind of took it upon themselves to collect evidence, which also I couldn't imagine would even be a thing that you would have conceptualized of prior to the establishment of the ICC, right? Because there was no place to go with your evidence necessarily, even if you had it. And these folks, like, a lot of them did not really understand how international justice works, or like what even the definition of a war crime is. A lot of people sort of just said that they like wanted stuff to go to, quote, The Hague, right? Which I think is a thing that we often sort of see. But they understood very clearly that like bad things had happened, and that in order for people to be held accountable for those bad things, you needed proof that they had occurred. So one of the people I interviewed was the city archivist, Ior Bakhtarva, who lived under Russian occupation in the now infamous Kyiv suburb of Bucha. And I know that for the podcast, Steph, I believe, interviewed AFP correspondent Danny Kemp, who was there quite soon after Bucha was liberated. And maybe you could say a little bit about what that was like, Steph.
Well, I think the reason Bucha is infamous, it was one of the first kind of suburbs of Kiev to be liberated after the initial Russian push. And in a street in Bucha, journalists kind of stumbled upon a number of bodies really strewn about the streets. And this was the first time we saw the visual evidence of that. And it's Bucha kind of became, well, I don't know if it became Ukraine's Srebrenica, but it's one of those, the word is a byword for atrocities and war crimes. And yes, the former AFP bureau chief in The Hague, who has now moved on and is doing the White House, was Danny Kemp. And he was in the kind of team of AFP journalists that stumbled on that scene for the first time. And he came on the podcast to talk about it, which was, it was really interesting to see somebody who'd been in The Hague and done kind of the, we do the trials, we do after the atrocities. We don't kind of stumble on the atrocities ourselves. And he was still grappling with having seen all that, but also like as a person who follows trials in The Hague, really kind of switched on his evidence mode, and this is what people will be looking for. So that was a really, really interesting interview, and we'll link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, Danny explicitly talks about in that interview, and also in subsequent conversations with me as I was sort of doing this reporting in Ukraine, about how much his approach to the reporting of the Bucha thing was influenced by sort of having sat through all of these trials at the ICC, which is just like another kind of interesting way that things have like sort of changed. So I asked Igor how he even knew what he should be looking for to collect evidence when I was speaking to him, because of course this is not a man who is a prosecutor, right? Like he's not a police officer. How do you even know what to pursue? So we'll first hear him speaking in Ukrainian, and then we're going to hear the our really fantastic female translator that I have, and she'll kind of give the translation.
Чергу надають перевагу допомогу армії.
So also, it's not our main job descriptions, obviously, this work, and also the war is still ongoing, and everybody's priorities, everybody's main efforts is to support our army as we go, not to do it. So this is secondary.
Немає таких практичних там семінарів, щоб навчання, як брати розслідування проводити, як брати спогади, як це все фіксувати. Те, що розуміємо, те, що знаємо, те, що дивимося, читаємо, якби намагаємось так.
По суті, волонтерська робота така, волонтерська.
Basically, it's this kind of volunteering work that we do on that side. Obviously, there are no resources for extensive trainings on how to collect this evidence and how to do that, how to psychologically approach that. So basically, we're learning by doing, and we're guided by common sense.
So, yeah, I mean, just try to imagine being in that environment, coping yourself with the tolls of war, worrying about your family and friends and whether they're okay, and desperate also to do your bit for success, whatever that means for Ukrainians, and also getting to talk to people about the worst days of their lives. And that's really, really tough. Just to say, we will be doing a couple of podcasts about trauma and dealing with traumatic materials, and we've been planning to do this for a long while, but I really believe that we're going to get it done this year. I'm looking at our producer as we are saying this because she's the one who owns all of that material, and we will get it done soon. So we'll follow up this podcast with that later in the year.
Yeah, this was something Alexander Ostapa, a journalist and activist who is based in Bucha, talked to me about. He kind of worked as a fixer for a lot of international journalists. And also, coincidentally, his wife works at the European Court of Human Rights. And so he had like a little more insight kind of into legal proceedings. I mean, the ECHR is not a criminal court, so it's different. But he clearly had been sort of like influenced like through his wife's work when I was speaking to him. And yeah, so he talked about how, it was really difficult to live through this horrific thing. And then on top of that, you're like trying to document it both for the world via the media and also with some idea that like this information is going to be used in future prosecutions.
Also, it's really hard to collect people's stories and evidence because a lot of people just don't want to talk about it, they just want to forget. Or sometimes they get so emotional that they cannot talk. And also, it's hard for me emotionally, listening to all those stories and writing them down. It's getting traumatized by that as well.
And I agree because I've been a fixer for ODIHR OSCE in October 2022, and I heard more than 100 stories during 2 weeks. It was like a psychological bomb for me to hear the stories from different parts. It's not just from Bucha, but it's from Irpin, from Dymyr, from Worzel. So it's really hard to hear, but it's really necessary to gather the information for future.
Yeah. And he said later on in this interview, like he showed me, he has on his phone like thousands of photos of videos of possible war crimes, right? Just pictures that he had taken or pictures that had been sent to him. Apparently at some point in Bucha, the Russians were just killing people who were like taking photos, and people got really paranoid. And so they started deleting evidence, and information, these kind of photos and videos off of their phones in case that they got stopped and searched. And so people were like sending stuff to him or sending stuff to other people. And so he's trying to like do like collection of this kinds of stuff. But yeah, I mean, there is no real clear way to distinguish between, what is evidence and what is not. I don't think you have a great idea of what could be useful at a future prosecution. Like it's, it's very helter-skelter in a lot of ways.
When I did really in the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, I talked to Quell, another friend of the podcast who does kind of atrocity crimes prosecution, collecting of evidence. And one of the things he said is that when people get in these stressful situations and they see these massive atrocity crimes, they tend to take kind of pictures of the aftermaths and the dead bodies. And he says that's the kind of reflex you have, right? I need to document these crimes. But he says they're kind of pointing the camera then at the wrong direction. I don't want to see the bodies. I want to see the people who are burying the bodies. I want to see the cars in which the bodies were coming. I want to see the insignias of the people taking the cars. So maybe if you have 10 pictures, maybe the one picture shows half a sleeve of a guy with some tattoo or an insignia that you want. And that's also the crime base evidence, the stuff that really happened. That usually is not what they use the photographs for, because that you can get by exhuming a mass grave, and that also tells you that 10 bodies were there in a way. But the truck driving away, that could tell you something. So a lot of people take pictures, but you tend to take pictures of the thing that you think is important. And of course, that is important to have an idea of how many people were killed. But essentially, in a trial, most of the evidence that you see is to link people to that crime. And that is probably very difficult to learn and also extremely dangerous. I mean, it's in a way, it's already dangerous to take pictures of dead bodies, as you explained with that story that Russians would stop and see what you have on your camera. And then it's not great if you have like 5 pictures of a mass grave. But what you really want is to have a picture of the guy guarding the mass grave. It's also so specific what a certain prosecutor might need and another one won't. So do we know if he's done anything with all these information and photos he has?
So he's turned a lot of it over to the Ukrainian authorities. He was present when international teams were excavating mass graves in the area. He's met with ICC investigators. But also, yeah, I mean, one of the things he kind of talked about is that, like, you have 20, people maybe took 20 photos of one thing, right? Like, right in the same way that if you like kind of go on vacation and you have like a diligent Instagram husband who takes 10 pictures of you standing somewhere so you can pick out the nicest one, right? Like, people have a tendency, I think, especially under stressful situations, to take a bunch of photos. And so then the question is like, do you keep one of these or do you keep all, 17 of them? And while maybe this one photo of a dead body is enough to, I don't know, prove identity or something like this, like, you kind of don't know what's like happening in the background, like what could be useful. And, I don't think anybody knows this, right? Because like you said, Steph, different prosecutors are going to approach things in different ways. And so, just the sheer quantity of information that is available, and you're just asking like these, not being asked, these poor traumatized people are sort of taking it upon themselves to like sift through this. It's just really mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it's the first time that we really have this kind of real-time experiment of how you collect the things and how these trials move forward. Maybe this means that you kind of kickstart prosecution and we're not always walking 20 years behind. But then again, you saw MH17 was in 2014 and the trial was in 2020. So, we're gaining. It's going faster, but it's still slow.
Yeah, I think I was really struck by that particular issue during the MH17 trial, where they did this kind of reconstruction of the Buk missile system moving from the Russian border to its place. And basically, like, the prosecution had this little video that was kind of like spliced together of like, CCTV footage, people who had taken videos from their phones of like these, big vehicles going through town, these like dashboard cameras that are very common in cars in a lot of these places in the world. And of course, I'm sure at the time, like, nobody thought that this was going to be critical information in like a mass murder trial, right? Like, if you see a dead body and you take a picture of it, you probably think like maybe this is relevant for a crime, but just like a weird car a weird truck with a thing on it going down the highway, like, probably, never considered the fact that this was going to be important. And so, yeah, it just makes me wonder like how much information, evidence could already be lost because you just don't even think that it is like relevant, basically.
One thing that strikes me out of all of this is we just keep on spending a lot of time concentrating on Ukraine, and we do Ukraine after Ukraine podcast. I feel guilty about that because it also means that we're not also doing other podcasts in other parts of the world. But I recognise also why we're doing it, because every aspect of what we're doing, Ukraine is showing an example of how it can possibly be done, what the problems are, what the challenges are, what's right and what's wrong about the different approaches. And Ukraine is like this huge cauldron of experiment. So I really appreciate, Molly, that you brought this material back for us and shared it so that we can spend another time just taking another look at this specific aspect of what's going on in Ukraine and try and also think about how that might apply in other parts of the world. I mean, where else are we going to get this kind of form of evidence and civil society collecting it and people desperate to collect things? I think it's happening in other parts of the world. So we also need to find the activists who are doing that elsewhere.
Geographically, we're in Europe, so we're in The Hague, so a lot of the Ukrainian activists and journalists and people collecting evidence kind of also rotate through our town. But that's what makes it so fascinating to us, and that's maybe why we linger a bit on Ukraine, because we see the experimental value of it and think that, like those other cases that were really vital, will probably spread out.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean, Ukraine really, it is this place where like a lot of new and interesting things are kind of happening, right? I mean, like from environmental crimes to investigations to this kinds of stuff. And I think, much in the way that everybody talks about the Balkans and the ICTY as kind of all of this pivotal stuff, in 15 or 20 years, when hopefully I am thinking about retirement, it's going to be Ukraine and people talking about that and how much things had changed. And I'm really just curious to see kind of what happens.
We're not going to wrap up this podcast by asking you the usual questions, Molly. If everybody wants to know what Molly's been reading and also what Steph and me have been reading and watching and listening to, they can head over to our Patreon and they can find out about it there. So let's just...
I don't get to talk about the most pretentious, weird book I'm currently reading?
No.
You don't want to even...
No.
No, Janet.
No.
Nobody wants... No. I don't get to talk anymore.
No.
It's over. We're done.
You don't want to give Molly the final word?
No.
You can listen to me on another international law podcast, though. How about that?
Is there anything that we didn't ask you that we should have asked?
Well, thanks for letting me kind of come on and rant about this thing that I found really fascinating, because I have a captive audience of people who are also sort of interested in this, which is not kind of most normal people. And so I've been very unfun at parties lately.
I was going to say, next time we're just going to have coffee and talk about this. No. And it was very interesting. I think it's super interesting to talk to people on the spot collecting evidence. And even if I see people here in The Hague, they're still filtered through a whole system before they get to The Hague, and they've told their story 100 times. So to actually be there and have people talk to you who are actually doing that in the moment, I'm jealous.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.